Freud had, of course, a terrific impact on arts and culture. And although he himself wanted to have recognition from science, it was much more difficult, I think, for science to acknowledge and recognise what Freud's work had offered to humanity. But within his lifetime, the arts recognised Freud's work and its impact and responded enthusiastically. Within his lifetime, there are two main areas where his work was greeted with enthusiasm. One was from the Surrealists in Western Europe, from Spain, France, Italy, and the other was in German Expressionism. So in France, the founder of Surrealism, André Breton, who himself was a medical doctor and a psychiatrist, was very interested in the effects of First World War on the returning soldiers, and so used Freud's theories of hysteria in order to understand his medical practice. But more than that, as a Surrealist, he was very interested in what Freud could contribute to a kind of general understanding of the self and of dreams and of irrationality and of violence and sexuality. So the Surrealists, especially the work of Buñuel, for instance, Un chien andalou, Salvador Dali, tremendous enthusiast for Freud, went to visit Freud and paid great homage to Freud. Freud himself was a little more suspicious of Dali and thought of Dali as what he called him a Spaniard. And however, the Surrealists themselves wanted to acknowledge Freud's influence. Unfortunately, Freud's own ambition was, as he put it, where id was, their ego shall be. And the Surrealists' ambition was really the other way round. They wanted to replace what they thought of as the great bourgeois ego with the id, the power of the unconscious, dreams, fantasy, rebellion. Because, of course, the Surrealists were part of a political project that was also about imperialism, countering fascism, and these were not central concerns to Freud in his scientific work. And through the Surrealists, really through three of Freud's books, the Dream Book, the Joke Book, and the book on everyday life. These were the three main texts that Freud had written for a general public, which in his own lifetime he saw realised as having an impact through the arts on a general public. And in Germany, for instance, in 1926, the Hollywood film mogul Samuel Goldwyn came to Freud and offered him $100,000 if he would give his name to the Hollywood remaking of the great love story of Antony and Cleopatra. Freud, of course, was very dismayed by this and refused and said that he had nothing to do with film. And he was a little alarmed to find that his colleagues, Carl Abraham and Hans Sachs and Bernfeldt, had agreed to work with the filmmaker Pabst to make a popular film that would be a cinematic version of the psychopathology of everyday life. And Freud himself sort of rather disapproved of this. He thought that psychoanalysis could not be popularised and that abstract ideas could not be given visual graphic form. But Carl Abraham and Hans Sachs and Bernfeldt were very enthusiastic and worked with Pabst, and they made this film funded by the German film industry, the UD, The Secrets of the Soul. Freud himself likened the popularity of cinema with bobbed hair and haircuts, and he said this was fashion and that he thought that psychoanalysis, he himself was not going to partake of this, but his colleagues would be free to do so if they wanted to. The German expressionists, I mean, after the war there was a general interest in Central Europe in the effects of war on things like madness and violence. And so you can think of Robert Wiener's film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, as a Freudian text, as an interest in Freud's ideas. And the directors like Fritz Lang and Robert Siodmak and Max Ophüls, all those who left Central Europe and came over to the West in the 1930s and set up in the Hollywood film industry a new genre of filmmaking, film noir, went on to popularise ideas of the detective thriller, of the melodrama, using popular culture as a way of thinking about sort of psychological structure. So within his lifetime, Freud was aware of his influence on the arts around him, especially German expressionism in the arts, in music, in painting, and especially in film, the new film industry in Germany. So filmmakers like Fritz Lang, Robert Siodmak, Max Ophüls. For instance, Fritz Lang's first film, M, is the story of a murderer. And in it, Fritz Lang uses very interesting cinematography of close-ups of the murderer and his trying to represent cinematically the unconscious sadism that informs his look at the child, and looks at the way in which the camera is thought of as a kind of predatory presence within culture. So Fritz Lang was very interested in applying the psychoanalytic ideas to the craft of filmmaking, the technology of filmmaking. This is something that we can also see in earlier films, like Robert Wiener's film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is very much about the study of insanity in post-war Germany. And although Robert Wiener doesn't explicitly cite Freud, there's a shared concern there around the effects of madness and violence on institutions and on culture more generally. In the Robert Wiener film, in the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the plot revolves around the question of who is the doctor and who is the patient. Where is the insanity? Who is responsible for understanding and containing the insanity? And the German expressionists sort of proposed the idea that culture itself was a container for our shared mind, the collective insanity of humanity. And of course, in the 1930s, when it was illegal for people with one Jewish grandparent to work in the German film industry, there was a huge exodus, a diaspora, cultural diaspora to the West. And this is when people like Max Ophüls and Alfred Hitchcock, Jacques Tourneur, Orson Welles, all went to Hollywood and began to make films in Hollywood. So then after Freud's life, of course, his impact at that point really disseminated very, very quickly and very widely through such things as popular cinema and popular culture. We can look, for instance, at the films of Hitchcock, very, very popular. Films from Psycho, where he uses the cinematography explicitly to replicate the movement of the stabbing of a knife to commit a murder through this kind of erotic gaze onto the body of the naked woman. We can look at films like Vertigo, where Hitchcock explicitly explores the themes of obsession and the gaze and following the object of desire with the camera and with the narrative. We can look at the melodramas of Ophüls and Douglas Sirk, for instance, very influenced by psychoanalysis, very often with characters in them, scripted in them. The character of the psychoanalyst plays a very important role in the women's picture, in the maternal melodrama. So Hollywood was very powerful in disseminating these ideas, popularising the idea of psychoanalysis as part of everyday life. Then, after his life, I think we also see the widespread dissemination of Freud's ideas through the academy and through high culture, through the analysis of culture. And this is something that then also affects very popular culture. Freud himself wrote about fashion in the interpretation of dreams and in his lectures, introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, where he points out that fashion and faction share the same etymological root. Faction, the idea of schism. Yes. So the way that culture divides itself into factions, into groups, subcultures. So in the book on the introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, Freud notes that there's an etymological history, a shared etymological root between the word faction, schism, and the word fashion. And although he doesn't develop this further, after his life, it was very much developed. This idea that fashion and clothing and visual appearance is a way of identifying cultures. Cultures identify themselves through their visual appearance. Within his own lifetime, his followers, such as John Flugel, wrote a brilliant book, The Psychology of Clothes, reviewed by one of Freud's colleagues, John Rickman, who said that this was a very interesting book on a subject of which many people were very ashamed, that there was a shame associated with the body, with its dress, with being interested or being concerned with dress. So even in 1930, the psychoanalysts were very interested in why themes such as fashion and visual appearance were considered to be somehow inferior or somehow insignificant. So following Flugel, fashion designers such as Elsa Schiaparelli, a very well-known fashion designer, originally Italian, very much influenced by Salvador Dali and by the surrealist sculptor Giacometti, eventually moved to America and launched her fashion design in America and then in London and in Paris, and followed the surrealist idea that fashion shared with the arts a capacity for parody and play and jokes, and the idea that fashion was a game that was being played through visual appearance, a game of pleasure and a game of desire, a game of illusion, but predominantly a game of meaning, of disseminating signs and clues between people about wearing symbols. So Schiaparelli was very famous at making a surrealist sort of fashion. Then since his death, more recently, Freud's work has been used very much by the analysts of popular culture. So the analysts of popular television, popular cinema, popular culture, and people think of the way in which ideas go viral, are contagious. The contagion of ideas, the contagion of desire, as something that really only Freudian theories can really begin to explain something like that. The way in which identity is such an important aspect of everyday life in the 21st century. And the way in which the forms of culture, the form rather than the content of culture, is something that has such power and significance. So contemporary designers, such as Vivienne Westwood or McQueen, Alexander McQueen, Martin Margiela in fashion, all explore ideas of the playfulness, the carnivalesque, the masquerade, and in these they follow partly the surrealist ideas of the 1920s, but more widely the Freudian ideas that there is something in desire that is not rational and that is more powerful than the rational, and that this is something that, like a joke, is something that is playful and something that is interactive, that is hypersocial. It depends for its meaning on a reciprocal relationship between the wearer and the observer. So there is an intuitive and an implicit understanding of the Freudian legacy and a use of that Freudian idea that we wear clothes in the same way that we inhabit our dreams. They are more powerful than the ego. We are lived through our dreams. We are lived through our visual environment, and we reciprocate and relate through our visual interface. And that is something that now extends through to new media, such as social media, the internet, digital media, and there are websites and bloggers for whom the popular culture of cinema, television, and the unconscious ideas of the dream and fantasy are very much at the forefront of the practice of sharing meaning and sharing culture. So it's something that is gaining meaning as we enter into new technologies of mass dissemination. And of course, this takes culture beyond the Western European privileged culture and takes it into a global dimension. And this is something that transcends national boundaries and even to a large extent class boundaries, because this is technologies that are very, very widespread on a global level, where ideas are being transmitted through an interface that is something that was inconceivable in the 20th century, and yet 20th century ideas, such as Freud's ideas, are at the forefront of understanding concepts like the contagion of ideas or themes becoming viral. Yes, I think that without Freud, there would never have been surrealism. And surrealism could have had a political dimension, fighting fascism in Spain, fighting Nazism in Europe. But the political dimension was not enough to explain surrealism. And the surrealists were looking for something that would allow them to understand the madness, the libido, the desire, the eroticism, but the violence of the unconscious. And without Freud and his understanding, surrealism could not have begun to formulate the way in which their ideas and their practices, the practice of poetry, of automatic writing, which they took from the Freudian idea of free association. They took their strategies and their techniques, their content, their ideas. If you look at a film like Un Chien Andalou, the Luis Buñuel and Dali film, the focus on, for instance, the attack on the clergyman, yes, is a standard communist idea or social idea or anti-clerical idea, but the way in which it's depicted, with a clergyman on a grand piano being towed by a donkey, is a purely irrational dream logic idea that was authorized and allowed because of Freud's dream book and his joke book and his book on the psychopathology of everyday life. That's a great point. I mean, that's a really interesting idea. The predominance of the selfie as a new genre of image making through the mobile phone and disseminated through the web is a really interesting case study. Is this a form of narcissism that's much to be regretted? Or is it a way in which people use new technology for self-reflection, for a form of self-analysis, for a way of becoming introspective? So there's a very interesting new campaign in which models were allowed, or they were asked, to take selfies, photographs of themselves without makeup, in order to sponsor, to raise funds for breast cancer research. And this was something that went viral, so that the selfie as a nakedness, as an undisguised form of self-reflection that's participated by film stars, is something that has led the way in new ways of thinking about new technology and digital media. And in that example, it's not a form of narcissism, extreme narcissism, but it's actually a form of communicating some form of intimacy and being up close and personal, the hypersocial, dialogical, interactive form of dissemination of intimacy and a personal, individuated reality. Yes, I think the internet has been used in very abusive ways to exploit intimacy and to persecute, but this particular form of disseminating the selfie as a way of raising funds, for instance, for cancer research, is an example of something that's up close, like the handheld mobile phone, that is a part of the self, where the self is being used to reflect back on the self. And there is some form of introspection there, and a sharing of an intimate, introspective space that I think is part of a post-Freudian legacy of an increased value of individuation, an increased valuing of that level of self-knowledge that originally was only available through such things as an official psychoanalysis, but is now become part of everyday life, in the sense that people think about themselves and talk about themselves and their Freudian slips, or their dreams, or their neuroses, or their it's entered now into this kind of common sense level of everyday life, and it's something that is now disseminated in very ordinary ways. It's not conceived as something special or mysterious or scientific or clinical or to do with special authority. It's to do with a form of self-knowledge that is widespread and shared in a very friendly way, in the way that friendships are based as a reciprocal dialogue between people. That Freud loved the unconscious. He loved the unconscious, and he understood it, and he wanted the unconscious to be recognized, and so that we could work with the unconscious rather than against it. And that was a revolutionary idea. I think if I were, on reflection, to think about the single most important contribution that Freud's work has made to the legacy of the 20th century, it is that Freud was the first not only to discover the unconscious mind and its structure, but to love the unconscious and to show us that without an understanding of the unconscious, without being able to work with the unconscious, we are trapped by it and we're constantly trying to defend against it and to work against it. And Freud's psychoanalysis shows that the unconscious is something that can be known and understood, and that is a source of energy and drive, and is a source of inspiration. I think that there are many ways in which culture in the 21st century is not the kind of culture that Freud would have been able to work within. He was unable to predict the rise of fascism, the Second World War, and the rise of different kinds of religious fundamentalist factions that have devastated the 20th century, continue to devastate the world. But I don't think that this is something that I would attribute. This is not caused by Freudian theory. In fact, Freudian theory is one of the only ways in which we're going to be able to understand such profound factions as religious fundamentalisms and their causes.